This isn't just a family disagreement, this is a full-blown unraveling of a carefully crafted fairy tale, and the people who built the foundation of Meghan's life are now saying the version the world fell in love with was never the whole truth.
Out with her mother, Doria Ragland, over just 2 words. Now,
continually make him look like a horrible slob and do everything they could to disparage him. It felt really wrong.
British. And I said, well, that's really nice. And then eventually the third time around it was like, he's a prince.
That every family has secrets. The quiet kind. The kind that sit at dinner tables and never get named. But what happens when the people who changed your diapers, paid your school fees, carried you for 9 months, and stood behind you before the cameras ever did decide they're done protecting the silence? Thomas Markle, Doria Ragland, Samantha Markle, a father, a mother, a sister. 3 people who knew Meghan before the headlines, before the titles, before the global image. And now, after years of watching from the sidelines, they're talking, and what they're saying doesn't just challenge the narrative. It detonates it. Thomas says the silence started slowly. Not a dramatic fight, not a screaming match, just nothing. Calls that rang and rang, messages that went unread. A father dialing his daughter and getting emptiness in return. No anger, no explanation, just distance. And he keeps coming back to one detail that makes this whole thing ache in a different way. This wasn't some distant relative. This was the little girl he raised, the girl he watched grow up curious and bright, the one he supported when no one else knew her name.
The stories would come out. So apparently, according to other journalists, we found out that there were a lot of porcupines.
From the outside, you'd never suspect a fracture. Public appearances showed warmth, smiles, the proud father image, the grateful daughter energy. It all looked effortless, natural, like nothing was broken. But Thomas says those moments weren't spontaneous expressions of closeness. They were timed, structured, built for optics. According to him, there weren't long, heartfelt conversations happening when the cameras left. No late night calls just to check in. No real connection beyond what served the moment.
No, not my last, but I still haven't seen my grandkids.
And here's the detail that hits hardest. He claims he eventually had to ask permission to speak to his own daughter. Imagine that. A father navigating layers of intermediaries just to get a phone call. Not because she was busy for a day or two, but because access itself had become controlled. Managed, scheduled. He describes it not with rage, but with confusion, as if he's still trying to reconcile the daughter he knew with the system that replaced direct contact. The contradiction is what keeps surfacing. Public interviews about gratitude, about family, about roots. And yet, behind closed doors, Thomas says the warmth didn't translate. He watched the world applaud a version of intimacy that he wasn't experiencing. He sat with unanswered calls while the public consumed images of closeness. That disconnect didn't just sting, it rewrote everything he thought he understood about his own relationship. There's something especially unsettling about watching someone you love become globally adored while privately feeling erased. Thomas isn't positioning himself as a villain in pain. He's positioning himself as someone bewildered by the duality. The charismatic, emotionally intelligent figure the world embraced versus the distant, unreachable daughter he encountered. And he insists the gap wasn't accidental. It was maintained that word, maintained, changes the tone of the entire story. Because drifting apart is human. It happens. But maintaining distance, that suggests design. Thomas says the narrative of closeness was deliberate, carefully shaped, public-facing. While privately, access tightened and spontaneity vanished. Then there's Doria. If Thomas's account feels heavy, Doria's feels quiet in a way that almost hurts more. A mother's perspective carries a different gravity. She's the woman who carried Meghan, raised her, shaped her. And publicly, she stood poised and elegant at major milestones, embodying grace and support. The world saw composure, stability, loyalty. But Doria now hints that the bond people admired wasn't as simple as it appeared. She describes visits that became scheduled, not casually planned, but formally arranged. Conversations that required booking. A mother having to coordinate time to speak with her own child. That single detail reframes the entire public image. Because the affectionate glances and shared moments the world admired, were they genuine or were they positioned? She suggests interactions often coincided with purpose, a public appearance, a narrative need, a moment requiring a supportive mother figure in the frame. And once the moment passed, the closeness faded back into formality. The warmth existed when it needed to, then retreated. What makes her account unsettling isn't bitterness, it's restraint. She speaks like someone who still loves deeply, but has accepted that love didn't guarantee access, that somewhere along the way she became a participant participant in appearances rather than a constant presence. She hints that Thomas's blocked attempts to reconnect weren't accidental, that his calls didn't just fall through cracks, they were redirected, quietly, systematically. The distance wasn't explosive, it was controlled. And then there's Samantha's siblings carry shared history that predates fame. Childhood memories, private jokes, the unfiltered years. Samantha says the shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in. Fewer invitations, shorter conversations, a new layer between them that hadn't existed before. Access filtered, routed that at some point, even basic conversations reportedly went through other people, not sister to sister, but through coordination, as if closeness required approval that she described something chilling, not dramatic rejection, but strategic spacing. Publicly, there were signs of affection, appearances suggesting bonds intact, but privately, she felt sidelined, not loudly exiled, quietly repositioned. And here's where the story stops sounding like ordinary family drift and starts sounding like choreography. Samantha claims interactions weren't just occasionally staged, they were evaluated, filtered, designed with outcome in mind. Each family moment serving a purpose before it even occurred. That suggests a system, not chaos, not emotional impulse. A system that she goes further, saying even the visible closeness between Meghan and Doria wasn't exempt from timing around optics. That mother-daughter moment often aligned with what needed to be seen publicly. When three people from different angles, a father, a mother, a sister, describe similar patterns independently, it forms something harder to dismiss as coincidence. They aren't presenting as a coordinated alliance. They're recounting lived experiences that intersect at one uncomfortable conclusion. The public image and the private reality diverge dramatically. Thomas describes silence. Doria describes scheduling. Samantha describes filtering. Three different verbs. Same undertone that the fairy tale the world embraced may not have been entirely false, but according to them, it was curated. And curation requires selection, which means some pieces are displayed while others stay hidden. That's the fracture at the center of all this. It's not about fame changing someone. It's about whether maintaining an image required reshaping the relationships that existed before it. That Thomas stopped expecting spontaneous calls. That Doria stopped expecting unscheduled connection. That Samantha stopped expecting sister-to-sister directness. And all three reached a point where silence felt heavier than speaking. Because when the public version of your relationship looks radiant while your private experience feels distant, that gap eventually demands explanation. They're not describing explosive fights. They're describing erosion. Quiet, managed, controlled erosion. And now the question hanging in the air is this: when public narrative and private reality split, which one survives longer? And here's where everything turns from painful to explosive. Because once you accept the possibility that the image was curated, you have to ask what else was shaped behind the scenes. And this is exactly where the whispers turned into direct accusations, where Samantha in particular stopped speaking in soft observations and started dropping statements that made even seasoned royal watchers freeze. That the gravity of her words lands like a stone in still water. She doesn't just describe distance, she questions timelines, motives, decisions. She brings up details that most people would never dare say out loud. Details that had circulated for years as rumor, but were often dismissed as tabloid smoke. And suddenly, she's not hinting, she's asserting. According to her, certain milestones that the public accepted as organic parts of a love story deserve closer scrutiny. She insists there were deliberate choices made long before the world knew what was coming. Choices that suggest planning at a level far deeper than anyone assumed. That's when the conversation shifts from family drift to calculated architecture. Because think about it. If interactions with a father required intermediaries, if a mother had to book time to speak, if a sister felt routed through layers of management, what does that say about how tightly controlled the entire environment had become? You don't accidentally build that kind of barrier. You construct it. Thomas circles back to the wedding era, the paparazzi scandal, the staged photographs he later admitted to participating in. He says he was guided, nudged, convinced that cooperating would fix things. And when the fallout exploded, he claims the blame landed squarely on him while the system that encouraged it stepped quietly back. In his words, the narrative required a villain, and he became convenient. He insists the story presented publicly, estranged father chasing headlines, doesn't reflect how the situation unfolded privately. He maintains he was trying to keep up, trying to understand the rules of a world that suddenly required strategy instead of sincerity. And when he didn't navigate it perfectly, the door shut. Permanently, that Doria's perspective during that same period feels different but equally unsettling. She remained publicly aligned, calm, supportive, the composed presence beside her daughter during historic moments. But even Samantha suggests that Doria's proximity came with conditions, that access was fluid depending on what the moment required. At one point, insiders observed she was deeply involved with the children, constantly present. Then quietly, that presence shifted, reduced, less visible. And once again, no loud explanation. Just recalibration. Samantha argues that this pattern, intense inclusion when optics demand it, quiet retreat when it doesn't, became predictable. She describes family as orbiting around a controlled center, allowed in when the frame needed filling and redirected when it didn't. And when you zoom out, that's not chaos. That's management. The most uncomfortable layer of this entire story isn't the hurt, it's the consistency. Three individuals, different relationships, different grievances, all describing a system of curated closeness. Not fake affection necessarily, but timed affection. Not absence of love, but selective accessibility. And then comes the identity shift. When headlines circulated that Meghan no longer identified publicly with the Markle name, choosing instead to be known by her married title, Samantha took it personally. She interpreted it as symbolic, a final detachment from the family foundation. Thomas saw it as erasure. Doria remained quieter, but observers noted how the narrative increasingly centered on a new lineage, a new identity, a new chapter with little visible acknowledgement of the old one. Names carry history, and in this case, history seemed to be edited. What makes this saga hit harder than typical celebrity family drama is the emotional texture. Thomas isn't shouting into microphones. Doria isn't publishing rage-filled manifestos. Samantha, while more outspoken, frames her frustration around transparency rather than revenge. They all claim the same motivation: the public deserves to know that what appeared seamless wasn't seamless at all. But here's the deeper question that lingers beneath every claim. Was this protection or performance? Because stepping into global scrutiny requires armor. Maybe boundaries were necessary. Maybe distance was survival. But the family's argument isn't that she built walls, it's that she built a version of intimacy for the public while maintaining those walls privately. That's the fracture that Thomas describes the heartbreak of realizing that spontaneous father-daughter connection had been replaced by protocol. Doria describes the quiet shift from organic mother-daughter closeness to calendar invites. Samantha describes watching a sisterhood dissolve into PR-approved touchpoints. And none of them describe a singular blow-up. They describe layers, years of layers that at some point Thomas stopped expecting callbacks. Doria stopped assuming she could just drop by. Samantha stopped believing private conversations would stay private. And in that slow transformation, they say something fundamental was traded. The unscripted version of family.fame does change dynamics. That's undeniable. But what they're alleging goes beyond ordinary change. They're suggesting intentional shaping of perception at the expense of proximity. That protecting the image required trimming the edges of the original circle. And here's the twist that makes the entire narrative even more complicated. They still express love. Thomas still calls her his daughter with softness in his voice. Doria, even while hinting at distance, speaks with maternal steadiness. Samantha's frustration carries undertones of longing. That's what keeps this from being dismissed as bitterness. The love hasn't evaporated. The access has that three people standing on the outside of a life they helped build. When you strip away titles, interviews, headlines, what remains is a father who feels written out of a story he helped start. A mother who adjusted to being scheduled in her own child's world. A sister who watched shared history get reformatted into something unrecognizable. And the public? The public consumed the polished version. The radiant smiles, the carefully framed family unity, the gratitude speeches, without ever seeing the backstage choreography that maybe both realities can coexist. Maybe the warmth shown publicly was real in the moment, but according to the three people who knew her first, it wasn't the full landscape. And that's what makes this impossible to ignore. Because when three separate relationships fracture along the same lines, controlled access, timed interaction, managed narrative, you're not looking at coincidence. You're looking at pattern. That the question that lingers now isn't who's right or wrong. It's whether authenticity can survive when image becomes currency. Whether family can remain organic when every move is evaluated for impact. Whether protecting a narrative eventually reshapes the person inside it. But Thomas says the truth isn't a simple royal love story. Samantha says the public deserves context. Doria says less, but what she implies speaks volumes. And somewhere in the middle of all of it sits a woman who rose from relative obscurity to global recognition, navigating a spotlight that few could endure without changing. Maybe she built boundaries. Maybe she built barriers. Maybe she built both. But according to the father, the mother, and the sister who once had unrestricted access, the cost of that construction wasn't just public controversy. controversy. It was private distance. And that's the part that doesn't make headlines. The father who stopped waiting by the phone, the mother who learned to confirm appointments, the sister who felt her shared childhood shrink into a footnote. Three voices. One unsettling symmetry. Because at the center of this entire unraveling is a simple but devastating possibility that somewhere along the way, the version offered to the world became more protected than the relationships that existed before it. And once that shift happens, once performance and private life no longer align, the people closest feel it first, not the tabloids, not the commentators, not the audience, not the family. And now, after years of watching a story unfold that they say never reflected their reality, they've stepped forward to say the fairy tale wasn't false, but it was filtered. Whether the world believes them or not, one thing is undeniable: silence held this story together for years. And once silence breaks, it doesn't whisper, it echoes.